This is a bit of a long story, so settle in. To give you some context, I'm from a city in the northeast of Scotland, UK. What I'm about to share didn't just affect me. It also involved two close friends, Debbie and Joe, not their real names. We all worked at Virgin Megastore, a job that brought us together as a tight-knit group of music and movie enthusiasts. I started there in 2003, Debbie joined in 2006, and Joe in 2007. The staff were like a second family, bonded by our shared interests and sense of humor. Every Christmas, the store hired temporary staff to handle the holiday rush. In 2007, one of those temps was Rory, his real name. Rory fit in almost immediately. He was a young guy, passionate about music, especially Pink Floyd, which was a big hit with Joe, an incredible guitarist, and me, who grew up on their music. Rory also had a love for filmmaking, and our shared interests made it easy to get along. Unlike most temps, Rory stayed in touch after the holiday season. He didn't live in the same city as us, but he kept connected through texts and social media, occasionally coming into town to hang out. By Christmas 2008, Virgin Megastore had become Zavi Entertainment, and Rory returned to work with us as a temp. I managed the stockroom, and he became my right-hand man. Rory could be a little intense, especially with his obsession over rare Pink Floyd live tracks, but he worked hard, and we had a lot of laughs. At the same time, Rory was putting together a self-made Pink Floyd documentary, even interviewing Joe and me for it. Given his limited tools, I was impressed with the result. In February 2009, Zavi shut down due to the global financial crisis. Despite this, the Zavi crew stayed close, organizing reunions and keeping in touch. In 2010, Rory even organized a reunion night out, which most of the local staff attended. By then, Rory was preparing to head to America for his second summer working as a camp counselor at Camp Wigwam in Maine. That Christmas, he returned as a temp at my new retail job, and I welcomed him back, at first. Things started to shift in 2011. Rory raised some red flags that I didn't immediately recognize as troubling. He claimed he'd landed a job working on the show Burn Notice during his summers in America, handling editing and camera work. It sounded impressive, and I congratulated him, believing it was true. He also said he was working with Camp America in Florida, which supposedly led to the Burn Notice gig. At the same time, Rory's behavior started to grate on me. He insisted on being the center of every Zavi reunion, even though he'd only been a temp. His Facebook posts hyped up casual gatherings like major events, which annoyed me, but I brushed it off as youthful enthusiasm. He also teamed up with a mutual friend to scout locations for a film. But my friend later confided that Rory spent the entire day asking basic questions about favorite directors instead of contributing any real ideas. By 2012, Rory became closer to Debbie, a stunning and kind-hearted friend I'd always seen as a sister. Debbie and Rory started hanging out, nothing unusual at first, but when Rory returned as a temp that Christmas, the cracks in his charm became obvious to more people. He began bragging about working on shows like Criminal Minds and The Wire alongside Burn Notice. Coworkers found his stories dubious and his tone increasingly smug, but because they knew I was friendly with him, they avoided sharing their frustrations with me. Things came to a head during a planned Zavi reunion. Rory texted me the day before, claiming everyone was going to a pub quiz, a setting he knew I avoided for personal reasons. Feeling excluded, I didn't go, only to later find out the pub quiz was a fabrication. When Joe visited me at work the next day, Rory tagged along, inserting himself into the conversation and answering questions directed at Joe as if he were his spokesperson. It was infuriating, but I kept quiet, not wanting to stir up drama. Joe, ever the happy-go-lucky type, didn't even notice Rory's behavior. By this point, Rory's obsession with Joe and his guitar skills had reached unhealthy levels, and I started avoiding contact with him. Debbie and Joe, however, were still charmed by him, so I tolerated him for their sake. Then, in early 2013, Rory claimed his father had suffered a life-threatening stroke, leaving him severely disabled. This later turned out to be a lie, a calculated attempt to gain sympathy, especially from Debbie and Joe. By 2014, things started to shift in a big way. Joe had moved back from Glasgow and was now renting Debbie's spare room, which seemed to bring them all even closer, except for me. Despite hanging out with Rory recently, and even letting him stay at my place multiple times over the years, I started to feel like I was being phased out of the group. Rory organized trips to 3 different Prince concerts across the UK, with Debbie, Joe, and another ex-Xavi friend, but I wasn't invited. At first, I was furious, but in hindsight, I'm relieved. Rory had paid for all the tickets, which raised another red flag. He wasn't working much outside of his seasonal temp jobs or his supposed freelance photography and video editing gigs. Yet he was throwing cash around for concerts and travel. It didn't add up, and I started wondering where his money was coming from. After those gigs, I blocked Rory on social media. His posts and comments were infuriating, constantly undermining people or picking fights over trivial differences of opinion. Debbie took issue with me blocking him, defending him staunchly. In hindsight, I realized she'd been groomed, viewing him through rose-tinted glasses. Against my better judgment, I caved and reconnected, unwilling to lose my friendship with Debbie and Joe, even though I knew deep down there was something deeply off about Rory. Throughout 2014, Debbie and Rory became inseparable. From an outsider's perspective, their social media photos made them look like a couple. Over the next 2 years, my connection to the group faded. Rory's visits to my place became increasingly bizarre. He'd come over under the guise of needing a place to crash before an early flight for a video editing job in the US, only for me to find out he'd gone back to his mom's house in the village instead. His lies piled up, and I quietly began distancing myself. I unfollowed Debbie, Joe, and Rory on social media, hiding my posts from them entirely. My plan was simple. If I bumped into them in public, I'd be polite, but keep it brief. Around this time, I started digging into Rory's stories about his time in America. I shared his claims with a friend and their flatmate, who had lived in the US for years. They were adamant. There was no way Rory's claims about working on shows like Burn Notice were true. Camp America strictly limits participants to working as camp counselors, and my research confirmed that Rory's camp wasn't even in Florida, as he claimed. Meanwhile, Rory's spending habits baffled everyone. Friends who still followed him on Facebook asked me, "Where is he getting his money?" He was attending expensive concerts across the UK almost weekly, some costing up to £200 per ticket, plus travel and accommodation. His excuses didn't add up. He claimed to make money from YouTube, but his channel had barely any subscribers, and most of his content was filled with copyrighted material. Then there was the secret second Facebook account. Its profile picture was of him and Debbie. I took a screenshot and showed her, but she dismissed it, saying, "Oh, that's just his American account." I couldn't believe how blind she was to the truth. By October 2018, I had completely severed ties with Rory. I'd even missed Debbie's wedding the previous year, where Rory had been a bridesman. I hadn't seen Joe in ages and had moved on with my life. Then, one afternoon at work, a friend came rushing into the room. "Hey, have you heard Rory was in court?" they asked, their voice urgent. My first thought was tax evasion or copyright infringement. "What for?" I asked, half joking. The truth hit me like a freight train. "For making videos of little kids," my friend said. Between January and November 2017, Rory had been pretending to be a girl online, using platforms like YouTube and Omegle to groom young boys. I was furious. An adrenaline-fueled rage consumed me for 17 hours straight. I couldn't believe it. All those years of feeling like something was wrong, all the red flags I couldn't piece together, had been right. He was a predator, and my friends had been completely duped. But worse than that were the poor kids he had exploited. The source of his expendable income suddenly clicked. I believe he was selling those videos on the dark web for Bitcoin profit. He was the first person to ever mention the dark web to me, casually warning, "Oh, never go there." Looking back, it was chilling. Rory eventually pled guilty. He was sentenced to 3 years and 9 months in prison, received a 5-year sexual harm prevention order, and was placed on the sex offenders register for life. Even now, I can't shake the anger and disgust. I'll never forget the way he manipulated everyone around him, or the devastation he caused to those kids and their families. If nothing else, I'm relieved he's behind bars, but part of me will always wonder how many more lives he damaged before he was caught. My freshman year of college was one of the best times of my life. Wild parties, new friends, and freedom I'd never experienced before. But it was also, without a doubt, the scariest year I've ever lived through. I'm 31 now, and I still look back on it, shaking my head at how I didn't completely lose it. One story in particular haunts me to this day. It stretched out over the entire school year, leaving me rattled and questioning my sanity. I've only talked about it a handful of times in the 13 years since it happened. It all started in August 2001. Like most freshmen, I was living in the dorms at a state party school. I'd opted out of a better college I'd gotten into. After graduating from a strict military prep school, I was ready to blow off some steam. My plans didn't go much further than surviving Saturday night. My buddy Bill, who'd also gone to my prep school, was living a few floors below me in the same dorm. As soon as my parents pulled out of the parking lot, we got to work turning college life into a non-stop party. For the first month, everything was normal. Classes during the day, sometimes, partying at night, chasing girls, and just living the dream. Then, mid-September, things took a sharp turn. One night, my dorm phone rang. This was 2001, so cell phones were still a rarity. Landlines were the norm. Groggily, I answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was strange, robotic, almost like an old-school GPS or a computer trying to talk. "Hi, Gary, how are you today?" Confused and half asleep, I asked, "Who is this?" The voice repeated, "Hi, Gary, how are you today?" Realizing I was being messed with, I hung up, chuckling to myself. It had to be Bill. Good one. I forgot about it and went back to sleep. A week later, I got another call. Same time, same robotic voice. "Hi, Gary. I'm watching you." This time, I played along. "Very funny, Bill. Shouldn't you be swimming in Everclear or flirting with a tri-delt right now? Cut it out before my roommate gets pissed." I hung up again, more annoyed than amused. The next morning at breakfast, I casually confronted Bill, expecting him to crack a grin and own up to it. But instead, he looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked. I brushed it off. Maybe another friend was behind the prank. Then, a few days later, I came back to my room to find my answering machine blinking. I barely even remembered the thing worked. I pressed play, and the messages made my skin crawl. Message 1. "Hi, Gary. I'm watching you." Message 2. "I thought I asked you to answer my calls, Gary." Message 3. "Where might Gary be on a Tuesday night?" I was annoyed, but still convinced this was just a friend, with way too much time on their hands. I played the messages for my roommate Cade, who'd known me since junior high. At first, he laughed, thinking it was a harmless prank. By the third message, though, even he was a little spooked. I started asking around. I went to my friends' rooms, casually bringing up the calls to see if anyone would slip. Nothing. No one admitted to knowing anything. Over the next few weeks, the calls kept coming. At first, once a week, then every few days until by Christmas break, it was a daily occurrence. I was unraveling. What started as a normal freshman year spiraled into a nightmare. I skipped classes, bombed exams, and my grades tanked, landing me at a shameful 0.67 GPA. I couldn't focus on anything, let alone explain to my family why college wasn't going as planned. I didn't dare bring up the calls, convinced they'd think I was using them as an excuse. After an uneventful Christmas break, I returned to school determined to get my life back on track. But the first night back, the phone rang. It was CVG again. "How is your family in Cyprus?" My blood ran cold. Cyprus was my hometown, a small suburb no one outside my circle should know. What kind of friend drags out a prank for this long? The calls escalated. They turned darker, more threatening. "I'm very interested in being close to you, Gary." "I have tools I can bring. It is going to all be over soon." By now, my friends were in the loop. I gathered them in my room, playing the messages back to back. Hearing them all at once, the gravity of it hit everyone. They were stunned. What had started as an annoying prank had transformed into something far more sinister. The messages got specific, referencing my parents' address and detailed threats of violence. "Cut open your esophagus, Gary, with a butter knife." To make things worse, CVG started mentioning Layla, a girl I'd reconnected with through AIM. She went to a school hundreds of miles away. CVG first referred to her vaguely as your friend, but soon started using her name. "Your friend, Layla, won't be safe for long." I called Layla, desperate for answers, but she was just as clueless and just as scared. Thanks for sticking through the backstory. It's important to understand the context for what came next. One night, a few of us were partying at a hotel. A friend of ours, Carl, had brought his big truck, which we usually relied on to get around. But Carl was out cold after downing an entire bottle of whatever, so he wasn't driving anywhere. I wasn't drinking that night and wanted to crash in my own bed, so I grabbed his keys and decided to drive myself back to campus. My plan was to return the truck and pick everyone up the next morning. I wasn't exactly a frequent driver at the time, so I wasn't the sharpest with directions. I made a wrong turn pretty quickly, but figured I'd keep going until I hit the main highway near campus. It seemed logical enough. Before long, I found myself on a desolate road surrounded by open fields. No streetlights, no buildings, just blackness stretching out into the night. The road itself was paved, but it felt like no one had driven on it in years. Around 3 a.m., I came to this bizarre four-way stop. It felt absurd. Why have a four-way stop in the middle of nowhere? Shrugging it off, I kept going, eventually finding my way back to the familiar highway, and then to campus. I didn't think much of the detour until a few days later, when CVG interrupted his usual litany of threats to say something chillingly specific. "You drove through the four-way stop at 3 a.m. My stomach dropped. How? How could he have known I was out there in the middle of nowhere, on a road I hadn't even meant to take? I hadn't told anyone about the detour. To this day, even after years working in military intelligence and tracking targets globally, I have no idea how CVG knew. From that point, the calls shifted focus. CVG began to fixate on the idea of a meeting. The threats ramped up in frequency, 10, 15 calls a day. My phone's ringer stayed off for Cade's sake, and I muted the answering machine as the calls recorded. But finally, CVG delivered the message I'd been dreading. We will meet in front of Coleman, Hall at midnight, Wednesday, 27 April, and we will take our friendship to the next level. I should mention that by this point, my situation had turned into a bizarre spectacle on campus. Everyone knew about CVG and the calls. People would knock on my door, eager to hear the messages, and my stalker saga became party gossip. To be fair, it scored me a few dates. Don't judge. As the day of the meeting approached, the dorm was buzzing with testosterone-fueled bravado. Guys were hyped, ready to defend me and get involved in this real-life horror story. By the evening, a crowd of 70 or 80 had gathered in the common area. Most of them eventually peeled off to pursue more traditional college fun, beer bongs and sorority girls. By midnight, I was left with a smaller group of about 15 to 20. I didn't want them shadowing me to the meeting spot and risk scaring CVG off, but I made sure they stayed nearby in case things went south. Coleman Hall was only about 300 paces from our dorm, and the glass doors gave them a clear view of me as I walked out. Midnight hit, and I stepped into the night, my pulse racing. The walk felt endless. Around 100 paces out, I noticed two things at once. First, there was a quick, subtle movement on the patio walkway near Coleman Hall. Second, the normally bright bulb in that spot was out. Later, I'd learn it had been smashed. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw him. Crouched behind a bush near one of the building's pillars, a figure in dark clothes and a hoodie was perfectly positioned to avoid detection. I realized I shouldn't have been able to see him at all if I hadn't looked at the exact right moment. My heart slammed in my chest as he started to rise, taking a cautious step toward me. Fight or flight kicked in, and I sprinted toward him without thinking. Behind me, my group burst through the glass doors, shouting as they followed. The figure bolted, running along the patio toward the parking lot. As I closed the distance, I realized this wasn't the mid-30s computer nerd I'd imagined. He was tall, broad, and athletic. I rounded the building's corner just in time to see him leap into the side of a running van. The van was waiting, its brake lights flickering as it shifted into gear. As the sliding door slammed shut, the van peeled out of the lot and vanished into the night. I stood there, shaking, as my friends caught up. A few had seen the scene unfold, but no one had gotten a license plate number. As we retraced our steps, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Near the bush where CVG had been crouching, there was a video camera on a tripod. It was pointed directly at the spot where I was supposed to stand for our meeting. It was still recording. This happened about 4 years ago when I was 20. The first time I met the man who would become my grocery store stalker, it seemed like an entirely normal interaction. It was Christmas time, and he was standing outside the store collecting donations for the Salvation Army. I'm naturally friendly, so I stopped to say hello. He was a tall guy, at least 6'4", and bore an unsettling resemblance to Lurch from the Addams Family. Dark circles under his eyes, short black hair, and a vacant expression. We chatted briefly about the weather, 2 minutes of polite small talk, before I waved goodbye and went on my way, not thinking much of it. Little did I know that this seemingly innocent moment would spiral into something that left me genuinely afraid. Months passed, and I didn't see him again. Then one day, while grocery shopping with a friend, she suddenly went quiet, her eyes wide as she recoiled. I turned to see the man standing uncomfortably close to me, less than 8 inches away. He smiled and said, "Hi, I remember you from December." Before I could even process how unnerving his presence was, he asked for my phone number. Being young and inexperienced with this kind of situation, I panicked and lied, saying I didn't know my number by heart. To deflect, I offered to take his number instead. I even pointed at my phone wallpaper, which featured my boyfriend, and made a point of saying, "That's my boyfriend," hoping it would dissuade him. It didn't. He gave me his number, which I immediately blocked the moment I walked away, ensuring he couldn't get mine in return. But then, as I put my phone away, he leaned in close, too close, and said in a low, almost conspiratorial tone, "Whatever I text you is for your eyes only." My blood ran cold. Trying to stay calm, I replied, "Sure, nice talking to you, but we need to get back to shopping." I grabbed my friend and practically dragged her away. When I asked her why she didn't step in earlier, she admitted he'd creeped her out so much that she didn't know what to do. Now, I'm not a small girl. At 5'8" and solidly built, I'm usually confident in my ability to handle myself. Rarely do I feel intimidated by anyone. But this guy, he made me feel small, vulnerable, scared. And as I would come to find out, this was only the beginning of something far more terrifying. After that encounter, I hoped I'd never see him again. Unfortunately, the opposite happened. It was as if he was always there. No matter when I went to the store, he'd appear. If I was at the checkout, he'd be at the end of the lane, watching. If I moved to a different part of the store, I'd catch him in my peripheral vision, lurking nearby. Once, I even noticed him following me to my car. That was when I decided enough was enough. I reported him to the store's managers, explaining what had been happening. They assured me they'd handle it and tell him not to speak to me. For a while, he stopped approaching me, but he didn't stop watching. Every time I went to the store, I'd feel his eyes on me. Even from a distance, the fear started to creep into my daily life. I'd dread going to the grocery store, scanning every aisle, hyper-aware of my surroundings. But I'm stubborn by nature, and I refused to let him intimidate me to the point where I'd stop living my life. Determined to confirm whether or not this was all in my head, I began paying close attention to my surroundings. What I noticed chilled me to the core. He wasn't just in the store by coincidence. He was deliberately following me. Every aisle I entered, every section I stopped in, he was there. The last time I saw him was the most terrifying encounter yet. I'd only gone to the store to grab a couple of items for dinner. As I approached, I noticed him standing outside the entrance, with his back turned. I thought I could slip in unnoticed. I hurried inside, but just a few minutes later, there he was, at the back of the store. Clutching my items, I made a beeline for the checkout. Near the front of the store, I ducked behind a shelf display, peeking out to see if he'd followed me. Sure enough, he appeared, scanning the checkout area for me. When he didn't see me, he stepped outside. At that point, my heart was racing. I darted into the nearest open cashier, quickly rang up my items, and cautiously stuck my head out the door to check for him. Not seeing him immediately, I began making my way toward my car. I'd parked a bit further away, near the side of the store where a row of smaller shops and restaurants were located. As I walked briskly toward my car, I spotted him again. He was standing by the entrance I had initially used to enter the store. My stomach dropped. I ducked behind a pillar, praying he hadn't seen me. Peeking out, I watched as he scanned the parking lot, looking for me. He didn't see me. After a tense minute or two, he started walking toward the front parking lot of the store. As soon as he was far enough away, I bolted. I ran to my car as fast as I could, jumped in, and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the lock. Relief started to creep in, until I looked up. There he was. He stood about 15 feet from my car, pushing a shopping cart, staring directly at me. It was obvious he'd chased after me when he saw me running for my car. The cart in front of him was just an act, a cover to make it look like he was doing something harmless. But the way he looked at me, he knew I'd caught on, and I knew exactly what he was doing. I was terrified, completely frozen. As soon as I could force my limbs to move, I drove home and immediately told my grandfather everything. By the time I finished, I was crying and shaking. My grandfather, a no-nonsense kind of man, told me to get in the car. We were going to settle this. We drove back to the store in his car. My grandfather walked me inside, straight to customer service, and demanded to speak to the managers, both of them. When the managers arrived, he asked me to explain everything that had been happening. My voice wavered as I recounted the months of stalking, the way he followed me every time I came to the store, and how I'd caught him outside my car. My grandfather didn't hold back, demanding that they ensure the man stayed away from me, or he'd involve the police. The managers listened intently, swearing up and down that they'd handle it. I don't know if he was fired right away. My friend, the one who was with me during our first encounter, told me she still saw him from time to time when she went to the store alone. But whenever I was with her, he'd be nowhere in sight. It was as though he knew exactly when I was there and made a deliberate effort to avoid me. Eventually, he disappeared altogether. My friend stopped seeing him, and I assume he was either fired or moved on to a different store. Whatever the case, I haven't seen him since. Even though it's been years, I still get chills thinking about that day. The moment he made eye contact with me through my car window, the smug look on his face as if he was in control, terrifies me to this day. The idea that he could watch me so closely, knowing exactly when I came to the store, and track me or avoid me at will, still makes my skin crawl.